Welcome everyone to Pathways Through the Orchard. Tonight's parsha is Pekudei. It's the last parsha of the book of Exodus, book of Shemot. And it begins, Eila Pekudei HaMishkan, Mishkan HaEdut. These are the accountings of the tabernacle of testimony. So, as everyone knows, Pathways Through the Orchard is the third in the Orchard series. So, of course, I've written in Orchard of Delights and Fruits of the Orchard much on every parsha. So, here I'm going to talk about things I haven't talked about previously. And we begin with the word Pekudei. First of all, it's in the plural, accountings. And the reason is in the beginning of the parsha, there's a very, very detailed accounting of the gold, silver, and copper used in the tabernacle. Very exacting, what everything went for, how much it weighed. And there's much to be learned about this on an individual level, the level of leadership. In fact, one of our Living with the Times is all about what we can learn from this idea of accountings. But I here want to do something different because this word has another meaning. And in fact, it has a number of other meanings. And the first is, it also means to remember. As part of the remembering is also the idea of redeeming. And as we'll see in the end, it also has the level of remembering for intimate relations between husband and wife. So let's start at the beginning. Again, in this context, Pekudei means accountings, because that is what's happening here. Moshe is instructing that every bit of gold, silver, and copper needs to be accounted for. But here we see that it also means to remember. How do we know that? So in the Parsha of Vayera, when Sarah, after a lifetime of barrenness, so it says, V'Hashem pakad et Sarah, kasher amar. And God remembered Sarah like he said. This is in Parshat Vayera, where in the beginning of the Parsha, God sends three angels to inform Avram and Sarah that they would, after a lifetime of wanting and trying to have children, they in fact would have children. And the angel said, in a year's time, you will have a child. And so the Parsha continues, but here, in the middle of the Parsha, it says, V'Hashem pakad et Sarah. Pakad is the same root as our Pekudei, the same root as accountings. But here it means that God remembered Sarah. So this idea of Pekud having two meanings is very meaningful when it comes to the month of Tishrei. Because in the Torah, Rosh Hashanah, the new year, is not called Rosh Hashanah. It's called Yom HaZikaron, the day of remembrance. Now, Zikaron, Lizchor, is a different word for to remember, but it's similar to Poked, Pekida. And so here we see there's an intrinsic connection between accounting and remembering, because what happens on Rosh Hashanah, the accounting for the year is done, and based on that, the accounting or the blessing of the new year is dependent on that. And in fact, the whole month before, the month of Elul, everyone is trying to do tshuva. And that tshuva is based on making an accounting of what I did wrong this year, what I did right, what I want to accomplish, what I didn't accomplish, what I still hope to accomplish. So memory and accounting go very, very much together. On Rosh Hashanah, there is a tradition, and in fact, what I just read, V'Hashem Pekudei Sarah, so this is part of the Torah reading on Rosh Hashanah. And according to tradition, 3 women were remembered for children. God remembered them for children. Now, when we talk about God remembering, it's not exactly the way we remember. But God blessed 3 women with children, and their accounting led to them having children. The first one is Sarah, like we mentioned. The next one is Rachel, and the third is Hannah. And according to tradition, they were all remembered for children on Rosh Hashanah. When we look in the Torah, what it says about Rachel, so there it does not use the word pakad. It says, Vayiskor Elokim et Rachel. That here the name Elokim is used. By Sarah, it's the 4-letter name of God. But here it says, Vayiskor Elokim et Rachel. And then the third woman, which is Hannah, so by her, just one second. By her, it also uses the word Vayiskor. And that is in the Haftarah, the very beginning of the book of Shmuel is read. And it's all about Hannah wanting to have children and being remembered for children, and then the song that she sang. And there it says that Elkanah, Vayada Elkanah et Chava Ishto, and Elkanah knew his wife, very similar to where it says, Adam Yada et Chava Ishto. Here it says almost the same thing, except the names are different. The Elkanah Yada et Chana Ishto, Vayizkareha Hashem, and God remembered her. And again, we're told that all of these rememberings were on Rosh Hashanah. So here we see textually the connection of the word Pekudei, being connected also to remembering. And this is God's accounting. God's accounting leads to his remembering, and again, God's memory isn't exactly like ours. We're using it metaphorically, but the idea is that God acts to remember these 3 women, and it's through God's accounting that, of course, we don't know what it is, but all 3 women, their accounting came to the place where they could be remembered for children. Now, the word pakad appears in a very, very important place, 2 important places. And that is at the very end of the book of Bereshit, when Yosef is about to pass away. And it says, Vayishba Yosef et bnei Yisrael lemor. And God made Israel promise, meaning made them promise to remember what he's about to say. And what does he say? Pakod yifkod Elokim etchem va'alitem et atzmotai mizeh. God will surely remember you and will bring you, will remember you. And when you come up from the land, you will take my bones with you. So here it's a double language. Pakod yifkod. God will surely remember you, meaning there's an accounting as to how long Israel would be in Egypt. And Joseph is telling them prophetically that you will not be here forever. There's an end to the exile in Egypt. And so when Moshe, after God appears to him at the burning bush, and God sends him back to Egypt, so Moshe goes back to Egypt, and he performs the miracles, the signs that God gave him to perform for the people. And it says, V'yamen ha'am v'yishma'u. And the people believed and they heard. Ki pakod Hashem et b'nei Yisrael. That God had remembered b'nei Yisrael. And it continues, V'chi ra'ah et anyam. And God saw their state of oppression and poverty. Vayikdu vayishtachu. They bowed down and they prostrated themselves. So here, Yosef promised them, this was like the code word. The code word that the time of redemption had come is this root, pakod pakadati, that God had remembered. So here we see a very, very deep connection. And the last connection, as I mentioned in the beginning, in the Talmud, in Yevamot, page 62b. So the metaphorically, when a husband remembers his wife, it's a euphemism for having intimate marital relations. And so this is also an important idea here, because the Mishkan is the place where God and the Jewish people, and ultimately it was meant for God and all of humanity to come together in an intimate way. That God's presence, God's Shekhinah was in the Mishkan, was in the first temple. And when people would go to the Mishkan, go to the temple, the presence of God was palpable. And it was life-changing, it was inspiring. And it was on the level of an intimate connection with God. So here, when it says that God remembers Israel, remembers these three women, it's talking about a remembering of love, that the time has come for God to fulfill his promises. That's why it says by Sarah, it says, and God remembered Sarah as he said that he would. Remember, he sent the three angels to inform them that they would have a child. And here it is a year later. And so God remembered, God fulfilled his promise. And that's why Yosef told the people, God will surely remember you. And when so, make sure to bring my bones out of here for burial in Israel. So this is just the beginning of the parsha, but it gives us a deeper understanding of the connection between accounting and remembering. And so actually we're told that the month before Rosh Hashanah, again, Rosh Hashanah is called Yom HaZikaron in the Torah. It's not referred to as Rosh Hashanah. And the prayers of Rosh Hashanah, we do mention that it's one of the blessings is on Yom HaZikaron. And so this idea is very connected to accounting. The astrological sign for Tishrei is Libra, and the sign are the scales. And the scales is a physical manifestation, a sign of the idea of an accounting. That when simply you go to the store and you buy vegetables and they put it on the scale, it's an accounting. But here we're talking about a more spiritual kind of accounting. And so we're told that the month of Elul, we are supposed to do an accounting. So if we do an accounting, then God remembers us for good. In other words, we can change our destiny. We can change our fate through doing tshuva. And that's what the month of Elul is for. So here we see an intrinsic, deep connection between remembering and accounting. So that is our first insight for the evening. Okay, our second insight is right after the accounting that happens in this parsha, the Torah goes back and goes over the clothing or the clothings of the high priest and the regular priests. Just like in the previous, parsha of Vayakel, all of this was, God instructed Moshe already in Parsha Truma and Tetzaveh, even before the golden calf, on all the details of the Mishkan and the clothings. But now it's the actual making of the Mishkan and all of the parts of it, the menorah and the table of the showbread and the altar of the incense and the ark, etc. And here in this parsha is the making of the vestments, the clothings of the high priest and regular priest. And so it's brought down in the Gemara that after the clothings, actually in Parsha Tetzaveh, is the first half of the parsha is about the clothing of the kohanim, and the second part is about the anointing of the kohanim and the dedication of the kohanim to be the ones to do the service in the temple. And part of that was bringing offerings. And so the Gemara asks, as it does often, what is the juxtaposition between the whole parsha, the whole passage of the clothing and of the offerings? And so the sages say, just like the offerings have the power to atone, so do the clothings of the kohanim have the power to atone. And then the Gemara goes into it in great detail. And this is in the tractate of Zvachim, page 88b, if anyone wants to look it up later, Zvachim 88b. And it goes through the 8 clothings of the Kohen Gadol. 4 of them are also the same clothing that the regular priests wore. The Kohen Gadol had 4 additional garments. So I'm going to go through it relatively quickly. We're going to go through the 8 clothings of the Kohen Gadol and what it atones for. And then we'll try to explain this idea of the atonement through clothing. So the first one is a tunic called a ketonet. And this is a rectification for bloodshed. How? Because this garment comes to atone for the brothers took the tunic, the garment of Yosef, and dipped it in the blood of a goat in order to try to make their father think that Yosef had been killed by wild animals. And so the tunic, the ketonet, is a rectification for bloodshed and murder. The second garment are the trousers, the underwear called michnasayim, and this comes to atone for immorality because the underwear covers the sexual organs and it comes to atone for sins done through sexuality or the misplaced use of sexuality. Then there is a turban, a mitznefet. This is a hat. This is where the kippah comes from, that the Kohen Gadol wore a hat. And so this is called a mitznefet. And this comes to rectify arrogance. In the Gemara, Rabbi Hanina says, let something worn high on the head come to atone for haughtiness. Haughtiness is symbolically when someone raises their head over other people. They're arrogant. They look down on other people. So the head covering comes to atone for arrogance. Then there is a sash, call it like a belt-like material called an avnet. And this comes to fix unrectified thoughts of the heart. Why? Because this belt or sash was worn right below the heart, somewhere between the waist and the heart. And this is where the Hasidic custom, or not every Hasid, but many Hasidic circles wear what's called a gartel when praying. That before praying, they will wrap it's very similar, like a cloth belt around themselves to separate from their upper soul and their lower soul, from the animal soul and the divine soul. And this comes directly from the clothing of the high priest. And since it was worn right under the heart, it comes to atone for unrectified thoughts of the heart. Then there's the breastplate. This is worn by the Kohen Gadol. This is it was connected by chains to the shoulder, and it had 12 gems on it, and written on it were the names of the 12 tribes. And there was a pouch, and in the pouch was the Urim and Tumim, the mysterious, I'll use the word oracles, that when there were serious questions that needed answering for all of Israel, they would ask the Kohen Gadol, and the breastplate would the letters on the stones would shine, and then the Kohen Gadol would arrange them through Ruach HaKodesh into an answer for the question. And so what does this breastplate come to atone for? For a crooked judgment, because it was called the breastplate of judgment. Choshen HaMishpat. The next one was a type of apron, an ephod. So this is connected to for the Kohen Gadol, connected to his breastplate. And this comes to fix and atone for idolatry. How do we know this? Because in the Gemara, in the prophet of Hosea, there is a juxtaposition of the name of this garment next to a type of idol worship. And so they learn that this clothing comes to atone for idol worship. Then there's a robe, a me'il. It was a bluish robe. And this comes to atone for lashon hara, evil speech. Why? Because at the bottom of the robe, this is worn by the Kohen Gadol, there were 72 bells and pomegranates. And when the Kohen Gadol would walk, they would like tinkle and they make a sound. And so the sages say the sound of the bells comes to atone for evil speech. And the last one is the head plate called the tzitz. And this was worn across the forehead. And on it, it said, Kadosh Lashem, holy for God. And so the sages say this comes to atone for brazenness, because many times the idea of the forehead is associated with brazenness. So these are the 8 clothings that the sages talk about. And each one, as we saw, is an atonement for something different. So then the question goes, though, well, how does that work? How does it work that clothing is an atonement? So, of course, for this, we have to go back to the Garden of Eden. And I'm going to keep this brief because in the Parsha of Tetzaveh, I believe we spoke about this, that the first garments are connected to the sin of Adam and Eve eating from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Because the Torah says explicitly, before they were naked and they were not ashamed. As soon as they ate from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, the Torah says they realized that they were naked and they covered themselves. And so the first clothing is, in a sense, the idea of trying to fix what they had done. Now, the nakedness was not the problem. We're actually told, what does it mean that they realized that they were naked? Because they only had one mitzvah to keep. That's all. God, the only mitzvah they had to keep was not to eat from the Eitz Hadat Tov V'Ra. And once they did, they became naked of mitzvot. They had no mitzvot. And as we pointed out, the word for clothing, beged, is the same root of the word begida. Begida means disloyalty, means treason. And so Adam and Eve committed treason. and their fixing was to clothe themselves. That became their fixing. That as long as they were in complete tune with God, their nakedness was not something to be ashamed of. It was a natural state. But once they fell into a state of disloyalty to God's word, so then they had to wear clothes. They didn't, at first, they themselves clothed themselves. Later, it says that God made clothings for them, clothings of or, with an ayin. And it sounds like or of light. And there we learn that through the sin, Adam and Eve lost a reality of their bodies being light bodies, and now they were bodies of skin. Because or with an ayin is our skins, or today it's leather. Their skin became like leather. So the symbolism of the fall of Adam and Eve is very connected to clothing. Now there's an expression that the kilkul, the spoiling or the blemish, in many cases is the tikkun itself. It leads to the tikkun. So here we have somewhat of a paradoxical understanding of clothing. Clothing comes into being as a symbol of their disloyalty, of their treason, but their blemish becomes their fixing. Because after that, after they have skins of leather, skins of flesh, then it became important that people realize that we're not bodies that happen to have a soul. We are souls that have a body. And so from all of this comes the very, very important idea of what's called tzniut, modesty. And that's why for both men and women, being clothed modestly is considered a great tikkun. Because what does it do? It hides the emphasis of the body, and it emphasizes the reality of the soul. I'd say somewhat unfortunately, in at least Western world, at least the Hollywood crowd, which has a tremendous influence on culture everywhere, it seems the more skin you can show these days, the more culturally awake you are. This is not exactly a Jewish concept, because there the idea is the emphasis is put on how much skin can you show, how much body are you advertising to the world, and it's as if saying I'm a body. I also maybe have a soul, and our belief is we are souls that are enclosed in a body. So this is a very, very important idea. So right now, I just want to go through some examples, because here, the Torah in two different parshas puts a tremendous emphasis on clothing. So just very, very quickly, I'm going to run through many different places where we see clothing, and the idea of clothing being a fixing, an atonement, is a function of consciousness. In other words, for what the sages say, this clothing is an atonement for this, and this clothing is an atonement for that. The way it works really is through kavana, through having the consciousness that this clothing has that power. But we see clothing in many different settings. So first of all, there is a mitzvah of the Torah that men should not wear women's clothing and women should not wear men's clothing. This is a very important mitzvah. Today, it's all jumbled together, and that's a whole other discussion. But the simple mitzvah in the Torah is, and see, it depends on the generation, it depends on the styles. And so according to Jewish law, there's a certain gray area here. But the clear black and white area is men should not wear women's clothing, dress up like women. And women should not dress up like men. And this is connected to another mitzvah that has to do with clothing, which is called shatnez, that we don't mix wool and cotton. Wool and cotton in clothing is forbidden. And this is what's called a chok. This is a law that we don't know the ultimate linen, excuse me, not cotton, linen and wool. Thank you, Toby. Linen and wool. And many people propose that this goes back to what happened with Cain and Abel, that Cain brought from the vegetable kingdom and Abel brought from the animal kingdom when they were bringing an offering to God. And God chose the offering of Abel, and this made Cain very, very depressed. The book of the Parsha of Bereshit speaks about this. And later, Cain kills Abel, partly because that his offering was accepted and Abel's was accepted and his wasn't. And so many people propose that this is the source of this idea of not mixing linen and wool. And so the idea of men wearing women's clothing and women wearing men's clothing also is what's called like a forbidden mixture. And this idea is in other areas also, like in planting. We don't plant different types of seeds together. We don't take a mixture of, let's say, wheat and barley and oat seeds and sow our fields. That we keep them separate. And so there's many, many different levels of what are called forbidden mixtures. And so one of them has to do with clothing, is not to mix linen and wool. Then we have men's head coverings and women's head coverings. This is a very, very important part of Jewish tradition, where married women cover their hair and all men cover their head with not all their hair, but cover their head with a kippah. This is connected to the head covering of the kohanim. We mentioned already the idea of the gartel, this belt that many Hasidim wear and they put on before they pray. And then in the Torah, these clothings are called likavod ulateferet, for honor and for beauty. And so this is a very, very important idea about clothing. When we talk about modesty, it never says that we should look like schlumps. It never says that we should look disheveled and wear, torn, dirty clothes. There's nothing wrong with a man looking handsome and a woman looking beautiful through their clothing. And in fact, we're told that that's how the kohanim were dressed, because they were doing the service of God. Well, in our day, and we've discussed this a number of times, we're all messengers of God. We're all shlichim. We all represent God and the Torah. And so the way that we dress ourselves, the way we present ourselves to the world, is for glory and for beauty. It should manifest our belief system, and that being a messenger of God is for God's glory and to beautify God. Zeh keli v'yanvehu. When we sang the song at the sea, we said, this is our God, and we will, there are many ways to interpret this, but we will beautify him. And this is the idea, what's called hidur mitzvah. The idea that when we do a mitzvah, we should try to do it in the most beautiful way possible. We should have a beautiful Chanukiah to light the Hanukkah candles. We should have a beautiful Arba Minim when we shake lulav on Sukkot. Should have a beautiful Kiddush cup. Should have a beautiful table on Shabbat. So all of these is what's called beautifying a mitzvah. And it's a mitzvah to present ourselves in a beautiful way to the world. Then we have in the practices of mourning, when one of the 7 close relatives pass away, we rip our garment as a symbol of a ripped heart. And we rip it near the heart. And the whole 7 days that we sit Shiva, we wear this ripped garment. So here again, the garment is representing something. It's symbolic of something. And so going back to what the sages were saying is that each one of these clothings of the Kohen Gadol, when the intent is there, was to try to fix brazenness and arrogance and sexuality and judgment and evil speech. All these different things, is that these clothings should remind us. Now, one of the most important clothings for a man are tzitzit. That when we wear a 4-cornered garment, it used to be technically only if you wore a 4-cornered garment. In our day, men purposely wear a 4-cornered garment. And the idea is, and it says in the passage about tzitzit, and when you look at the fringes, you should remember all of the mitzvot. So here again, we see this idea of intent. Here we have fringes on the 4 corners, but symbolically, they are to remind us of all the mitzvot. And in fact, they find a numerical hint to this, that the word for tzitzit equals 600, and there are 8 strings on each of the 4, but and each one there's 8 and there's 5 knots. So it's brought down that 8 and 5 is 13, plus the 600 from the word tzitzit equals 613. And that's what it says when we read the passage morning and evening, that by looking at the tzitzit, we should remember all the mitzvah. So in a sense, when the Kohen Gadol wore these clothings, the idea is that when he would put on the Choshen Mishpat, he didn't sleep in this. Every day he would put it on. he would have the intent that this should help fix judgment in the world. And when he put the sash on, the belt, that this should fix any strange thoughts of the heart. Okay, so that's the basic idea. But now I want to take it down to just one specific. And that is the role of clothing in Yom Kippur. When we read Musaf on Yom Kippur, the central part of Musaf, the additional prayer of Yom Kippur, is a visualization of following the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, as he did the service in the temple when there was a temple. And part of the service, it lasted all day long, just like we're in synagogue almost all day long. The Kohen Gadol from morning until evening was doing different parts of the service. And parts of the service was that he changed his clothes 5 times during the service. And each time he would go to the mikveh. The Kohen Gadol went to the mikveh 5 times, and he changed his clothing 5 times. And most of these occasions, he was going from wearing 8 garments to wearing just 4 garments. Some of the service in Yom Kippur called for only 4 garments, and some called for all 8. And so here we see, again, the idea of his changing the garments in tune with the essence of the avoda that he was doing, is again pointing out how the clothing represents deeper ideas. They're not just outer garments, but they are symbolic of different ideas. And when we brought the examples very quickly, we saw different aspects of garments represent different things. So in our day, it is a widespread, almost universal custom that both men and women wear white on Yom Kippur. And we're told that it's for 2 reasons. One is because on Yom Kippur, because we're not eating and drinking, we're not wearing leather shoes that are comfortable, anointing ourselves and having intimate relations. So we're somewhat separated from our physical nature. And we are, in a sense, imagining being on the spiritual level of angels. And when we think of angels, we think of white. So men and women wear white on Yom Kippur. Again, here's a symbolic understanding of clothing. And men wear a kittel. Married men wear a special robe that they first wore at their wedding. And it's only worn a few times a year. It's first worn by a man at his wedding, and then on Yom Kippur. Some wear it, far fewer, but some wear it on Rosh Hashanah as well. Some also wear it on Hoshana Rabbah. And there is a fairly wide custom to wear it at the Seder of Pesach, Seder night. Those are the only times that we wear this, but the one other time that a man wears is when he's buried. that a man will be buried with his kittel. And so we're told that on Yom Kippur, it's a little bit paradoxical that on one hand, we're envisioning the white clothes as representing being angelic, and at the same time, it's reminding us of our day of death. Not in a depressed way, not in a morbid way, but a very realistic idea that none of us are going to live forever. We all are going to return our souls and have a judgment. And of course, from Rosh Hashanah to Yom Kippur is the days of judgment. So there's a very, very interesting idea here is in the Zohar, in the Torah itself, Yom Kippur is never called Yom Kippur. It's called Yom HaKippurim. Yom HaKippurim has the same meaning as Yom Kippur, but the Zohar, in an amazing drasha, says Yom Kippur is Yom Kippurim. Yom Kippurim, Yom like Purim. Yom Kippur is a day like Purim. So everyone comments on this. On the surface, it seems that Yom Kippur and Purim are the farthest apart that you can imagine. Yom Kippur, we don't eat and we don't drink. It's called Shabbat Shabbaton, all the forbidden works. And on Purim, we're eating, we're drinking, sometimes to an excess. There's no forbidden acts on Purim, meaning halachically. There's no forbidden work on Purim. And so what's interesting is, for many, many, many people, part of the whole experience of Purim is wearing a costume. And so here you see something very interesting, that on Yom Kippur, we also wear a costume in a way. We dress up like angels, or we dress up like the day of our death. And on Purim, okay, so people wear all kinds of things, all kinds of things. But the idea is that, and it's very connected what we said about clothing before, is in a certain way, I don't know if you've ever been to, like, let's say a Purim costume party, where sometimes you literally don't know who you are talking to, because the costume, like the masks and the costumes, you don't really know who's who. So in a certain way, the clothing hides the person, but in another way, it reveals a certain part of a person that they would ordinarily never reveal about themselves. And that's why a lot of people on Purim dress up in like an alter ego. They dress up in a way that it's a part of them that they would like to express or even make fun of. It doesn't mean that, well, this is the real me. It could be just the opposite. This is a part of me that I'd like to have fun with. Or it's the opposite of me. It's the opposite of me. So here we just see a very interesting connection with clothing and the symbolism of clothing between Yom Kippur and Purim. Again, Yom Kippurim, Yom Kippurim. And here we see a deep connection through the clothing. There are much deeper connections between Yom Kippur and Purim, but that will be for a different time. Okay, we have one more insight for today, and that is that in Parshat Pekudei, the major craft person who is in charge of making the Mishkan is Betzalel. Betzalel ben Uri ben Hur ben Yehuda. And the Baal HaTurim points out that this is actually the third time that the Torah introduces Betzalel. He's introduced in Parshat Ki Tetzei. He's introduced again in Parshat Vayakel, and here a third time. And each time it goes to his lineage. And here it says, and it says this previously also, it says, God said to Moshe, see, I have called by name Betzalel, son of Uri, son of Hur, from the tribe of Yehuda. I will fill him with the Spirit of God, with wisdom, understanding, and knowledge. And so the Baal HaTurim points out something very interesting, and that is that why three times? So the Baal HaTurim says because God granted Betzalel three levels, we'll call them gifts of wisdom, understanding, and knowledge. And because God graced him and inspired him with these three levels of consciousness, the Torah mentions him three times. Now, I'm going to mention this in passing because when it talks about Betzalel and in Parshat Vayakel and in this Parsha also, it mentions many times that all the people who did the work of the Mishkan, both men and women, were called Nadiv Lev, Chachma Lev, wisdom of the heart. And Betzalel, it's mentioned many times that he's blessed with Chachma utvuna v'dat. Tvuna is the same root as Bina. And so this is an interesting thing. I'll just mention in passing one of the books I'm working on is on the Sfirot and meditation, understanding the Sfirot in a meditative way. And one of the parts or one of the chapters is trying to show where the 10 Sfirot are mentioned in the Tanakh. In other words, sometimes we think of the Sfirot as Kabbalistic and maybe a later development. There is some truth to that. But in one of the parts of the proposed book, someday, Bezrat Hashem, it will come into being, I go through all the different Sfirot and where they appear in the Torah. And what we come out of it is that all of the Sfirot are mentioned many, many times in the Tanakh. And the only reason I'm mentioning this is because the probably the most important places where Chachma, Bina, and Dat are mentioned is here, is in the making of the Mishkan. These three words and concepts are mentioned many, many other times in the rest of the Tanakh. But here's the what's called the headquarters. This is the major context of Chachma, Bina, and Dat. And here it says specifically that God it will fill Betzalel with these energies, these faculties of Chachma, Bina, and Dat. But one idea that I want to explore here and our time is limited here. We have two different traditions as to why Bezalel was chosen. Why was Bezalel chosen? So here it says specifically that he is the son of Uri, the son of Hur. In other words, he's the grandson of Hur. Who is Hur? He's a bit of a mysterious person that when Israel is fighting against Amalek and Moshe is standing on the hill and his arms get tired, there are two people who support his arms in prayer, Aaron and Hur. The other time that Hur is mentioned is in Parshat Mishpatim, that in the days leading up to the giving of the Torah. So the Moshe and Aaron and his sons and Hur went up and had this vision of God. But we don't know very much about Hur. And then we have a midrash, it's not explicit in the Torah, that when the people saw that Moshe wasn't coming back, or thinking that Moshe wasn't coming back, so they wanted to build a golden calf. And Hur stood up and he said, there's no way you're going to make a golden calf. And according to tradition, they killed him. And this is the reason given why Aaron was reluctant to try to stop them, because he said, well, they're going to kill me also. And so he tried to stall. He told them, bring me all your gold. He thought they wouldn't bring the gold, but they did bring the gold. And then he threw it in the fire, thinking he was getting rid of it. And through magical means, some magicians made a golden calf come out. And so Hur is killed trying to defend the Torah, trying to stop the people from idol worship. So there's a Midrash Rabbah, says like this. And again, in the Torah, it says, see, I have called by name Bezalel, son of Uri, son of Hur. So the Midrash asks, why is Hur's name? Why is it important that we know that Bezalel is the grandson of Hur? And so it says, when Israel wished to commit idolatry, Hur offered his soul for the sake of God and would not allow them to sin. They rose against him and killed him. God said to him, by your life, I will repay you. How is he being repaid? His grandson is now being chosen to be the one to make the Mishkan. And in this week's Parsha, we know that Bezalel was in charge of all of the work. Ultimately, Moshe was the top of the ladder, but it was Bezalel that was carrying out the instructions. But in this week's Parsha, the only thing that it connects Bezalel's name with is the making of the Aron. What is in the Aron? The 2 tablets of the law. This is what Hur gave his life for. He knew that Moshe was coming down with the Torah. And he was trying to stop the people in enough time that Moshe could come down with the Torah. So when God says, by your life, I will repay you, you will have a grandson that will craft the Aron where the Torah will be housed. When Hur and Aaron are holding up the arms of Moshe, so Hur is from Yehuda. He is a kingly person. Aaron is the high priest. So here you have the high priest and the king, as it were, holding up the hands of Moshe. But now I said there's a bit of a paradox here, because here we see, in a sense, Hur is being paid back for what he did by God choosing his grandson. And that's why he says, see, I have called by name Bezalel. But we have another couple of midrashim that say something very, very different. And what it says in short is, and what does it mean, see, I have called him by name? So the midrash says that God showed Adam however we understand this, a historical book of all the tzaddikim who would ever be born into the world. In other words, the Gemara says Adam could see from one end of the world to the other. But that also means not just spatially, he could see from the past to the future. And God says, these are all of the tzaddikim that will be in the generations. And God says to him, I have appointed all of these from the time of creation, and Bezalel also I have appointed from that time. And that's why it says, see, I have called Bezalel by name. And then later also, it says that God showed Moshe this book of Adam. And that's why he says, see, I have called Bezalel. So here, the point I want to make, and it could be part of an incredibly deep and philosophical discussion. It seems to be two different traditions of who is Bezalel. One seems to say that God chose him from creation. He was destined to build the Mishkan. The other midrash seems to say that because Hur gave up his life, so he was rewarded and had a grandson that, in a sense, would carry on his work. So you could ask, well, which one of these traditions is correct? Was Bezalel chosen by God from the beginning of creation and, as it were, had nothing to do with Hur? Or it had everything to do with Hur? Now, there is a way that you could put this together. If Adam can see from one end of the world to the other, obviously God is showing him this, we'll call it a book, where all the tzaddikim, remember, this is the same book that we have the tradition that Adam saw the soul of David, but saw that David had no time apportioned to him. So he gave 70 years of his life. It's the same tradition. So, but you can put them together. God sees everything in the future. So he also saw Hur. And so we could say there's no contradiction here at all. Both of these are possibly true. That there's something about Bezalel, and yet we see that God says, I will fill him with Chachma, Bina, and Dat, which implies that on his own, he didn't have it. But God blessed him. Now, was he blessing him because of what Hur did? Or even deeper, was he blessing him through what would come from him? Now, remember, he's from Yehuda. Who else comes from Yehuda? King Solomon. And what's interesting to note is that Bezalel was 13 years old when he was commanded to be the craft person for the Mishkan. Solomon, Shlomo HaMelech, was 12 years old when he became king. And I want to mention, it's important to mention that some of these ideas that I'm mentioning, I saw in a book by Rabbi Ari Kahn called Explorations. And some of these ideas are what he wrote here. And so here, Rabbi Kahn brings that later Isaiah, when he's talking about Mashiach, and in fact, those who come to the Tuesday class, we actually quoted this in our last class, where as part of the description of Mashiach, he says, and a child will lead them all, implying either in age or in consciousness or mentality, Mashiach has a youthful worldview or a consciousness. And here we see Betzalel was 13 years old, Shlomo was 12 years old. And just like Betzalel is from Yehuda, and he builds the Mishkan, Shlomo HaMelech is from Yehuda, from his father David, and he builds the temple. And so here is just something to think about, is here we have the very, very fine line between free will and determinism. Because one of the Midrashim says clearly God determined from the time of creation who Betzalel was. And the other Midrash is implying that it's more through the actions of Hur that Betzalel was chosen. But like we said, we could put the two together and see that they're not a contradiction, that they both are true at the same time. So we'll end with a blessing. And the blessing is that we could see the third temple. I have to mention that one of the Living with the Times this week is about the secrets of the third temple, connected to this week's Parsha of the Mishkan. Hopefully everyone will take time and will watch it. But we should merit to see the building of the third temple. And that third temple should be the house of prayer. God says it is the house of my prayer for all peoples. May we merit to see this.